On the morning of May 1st, 1960, May Day of all days, a lone aircraft crossed into Soviet airspace at 70,000 feet, higher than any fighter could reach, higher than most missiles could climb. The pilot believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. And the moment that plane went down, not just the plane, but the lie that followed, nearly unraveled every diplomatic thread holding the Cold War together. A summit between two superpowers collapsed. A president was publicly humiliated, and the world slid closer to nuclear conflict than most people ever knew. Here's the question nobody asks. Was it the spy plane that caused the crisis, or the decision to keep flying it? This is the story of the U-2, the aircraft built to see everything, and the day it showed the world exactly how dangerous that ambition could be. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War was no longer just political. It was existential. After the Soviet Union detonated its first hydrogen bomb in 1953, Washington was gripped by a single terrifying question. What is the USSR actually building and where? Satellites didn't exist yet. Ground-level intelligence was slow, dangerous, and unreliable. President Eisenhower needed a better answer. He needed eyes in the sky. Enter the CIA, Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, and a man named Kelly Johnson, arguably the greatest aircraft designer in American history. In 1954, Johnson's team was handed one of the most audacious engineering briefs ever written. Build a plane that can fly so high, so fast, and so far that the Soviets simply cannot stop it. The result was the U-2, a glider with a jet engine, fragile, temperamental, and almost impossible to fly, but capable of cruising at altitudes where the sky turned black and the curvature of the Earth was visible through the cockpit window. It was a marvel, and it was, from the very beginning, a provocation. The U-2 program launched in 1956 under the codename Aquatone. From the start, Eisenhower was uneasy. He personally approved every single overflight mission, every one. That tells you something about the stakes he understood were involved. The early missions were extraordinary. Flying out of bases in Turkey and Pakistan, U-2 pilots photographed Soviet airfields, missile sites, and military installations with a clarity no one had ever seen from the air. The intelligence was invaluable. But here is the cause and effect that history often skips. The Soviets knew. They tracked the U-2 on radar from the very first overflight. They filed formal protests through back channels, quietly, so as not to publicly admit their airspace had been penetrated. And with each mission that went unanswered, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's humiliation deepened. The Americans read Soviet silence as permission to keep going. That was the first fatal miscalculation. By 1960, Soviet surface-to-air missile technology had caught up. The SA-2 guideline missile could now, under the right conditions, reach U-2 altitude. CIA analysts knew this. Some argued the missions had become too risky. Eisenhower nearly canceled the program. Then, intelligence suggested the Soviets were accelerating their ICBM development, and the overflights resumed. On May 1, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan in a U-2 designated Article 360. His mission photographed Soviet missile facilities across a 3,000-mile route, then land in Norway. He never made it. Near Sverdlovsk, deep inside Soviet territory, an SA-2 battery fired a salvo of missiles. The first detonated close enough to the U-2 to shatter its tail. The plane went into an uncontrollable dive. Powers ejected. He survived. And here's where the story becomes something far more dangerous than a downed aircraft. Washington, not yet knowing Powers was alive, issued a cover story. NASA announced that a weather research plane had gone missing near Turkey. A navigational error, nothing more. It was a carefully constructed lie, backed with fabricated details and a decoy aircraft painted with NASA markings. Khrushchev let them finish. Then he revealed that the Soviet Union had recovered not just the wreckage of the U-2, but the pilot, the camera, the developed film, and the spy equipment, all of it intact. The cover story collapsed in real time, on the world stage. Eisenhower, one of the most respected military figures of the 20th century, stood exposed as having lied, not just to the Soviets, but to the American public and their allies. 12 days later, Eisenhower arrived in Paris for a four-power summit, a rare high-stakes meeting with Khrushchev, British Prime Minister Macmillan, and French President de Gaulle. It was supposed to be a turning point in Cold War diplomacy, a moment toward peace. Khrushchev arrived with an ultimatum: apologize for the U-2 overflights, punish those responsible, and guarantee they would never happen again. Eisenhower refused to apologize. He suspended future overflights, but he would not grovel. Khrushchev walked out. The summit collapsed before it began. A planned visit by Eisenhower to the Soviet Union was canceled. Any momentum toward de-escalation evaporated. Powers was tried in Moscow, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 10 years. He was exchanged for Rudolf Abel in 1962. The same year, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the very edge. The U-2 incident didn't cause the Cuban Missile Crisis. It poisoned the diplomatic atmosphere that might have prevented it. The Americans didn't abandon aerial reconnaissance. They accelerated it. The U-2 was eventually joined by the SR-31 Blackbird, faster, higher, even more extraordinary. And then came satellites, which rendered manned overflights largely obsolete within a decade. But the U-2 itself never really stopped flying. The U.S. Air Force still operates U-2s today. The airframe is over 60 years old. It is still, somehow, irreplaceable. What never got fixed was the underlying problem: the gap between what intelligence agencies believe is acceptable risk and what heads of state are willing to publicly own when things go wrong. 3 things to take from this story. First, silence is not consent. The Soviets tracked every U-2 mission and said nothing publicly. Washington interpreted that silence as tolerance. It was actually a slow accumulation of grievance, waiting for the right moment to explode. Second, cover stories have a shelf life. In the information environment of 1960, before the internet, before smartphones, a state lie still collapsed within days when the physical evidence contradicted it. The lesson about transparency in statecraft has only become more urgent since then. Third, the most dangerous moment in any arms race is not the weapon, it is the miscalculation. The U-2 wasn't built to start a war. It was built to prevent one by providing clarity. But the decision to keep flying it past the acceptable risk nearly did the opposite. We often think of war as something that begins with a decision, a declaration, a deliberate act. But the U-2 incident is a reminder that some of the closest calls in history arrived not through intent, but through assumption. The assumption that the other side wouldn't notice, that the cover story would hold, that one more mission was worth the risk. The question worth sitting with is this: in a world of surveillance satellites, hypersonic missiles, and AI-driven intelligence, who today is making the same assumptions? If this changed how you think about the Cold War or about how close we've actually come, hit subscribe. Next week, we're going inside the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. 13 days that make this story look like a warm-up. Don't miss it.